good to be back here. It feels like yesterday. So this morning I'm privileged to be back on this stage to speak to you about a very important topic that was last spoken in August 2008 at the Mexico International AIDS Conference, where in a closing plenary, Justice Edwin Cameron, who you may all know is a judge in the Constitutional Court of South Africa and the only highest-ranking African official who has come public about his HIV status, inspired us to a political call of action towards addressing the issue of deliberate infection. I stand here to speak about what has happened since then and to also have my own call to action so that we can finally put to rest the bed, this thorn that we call HIV criminalization. I trust that you will be persuaded to join me in this journey and ensure that the next time we are speaking on the podium about this topic, we have fought the fight against bad laws in the era of HIV. I'll not have the privilege of a PowerPoint presentation, but this is how I plan to walk you through this conversation. We will have a quick one-on-one so that we're all on the same page on what HIV criminalization is. We will quickly walk through what the successes have been, and then we will see what is left for us to be able to take forward. And this will not be a high-level talk. I will end the talk with practical recommendations for everyone in this room that you can leave and be able to take forward to put words into action and for us to be able to see change. So let me start talking by what do we mean when we talk about HIV criminalization. HIV criminalization is the use of unjust laws or applying unjustly a criminal law to people living with HIV based solely on their HIV status. This could be a specific criminal law targeted for HIV, or it could be a general criminal law that does not specifically mention issues of HIV. So what does the law then punish? The law punishes non-disclosure. If you're HIV positive and you fail to disclose to your partner, then in certain jurisdictions, the law does punish that. In other jurisdictions, the law punishes exposure. You do an act, you do something that puts the other person at a risk of getting infected, then you can be punished by the law. Thirdly, what does the law again punish? Transmission, where there is actual transmission and the other person gets infected. So those are the three things that the law seeks to punish. And the basis of these laws is very irrational. It is based on fear, which leads to stigma, which eventually manifests itself in terms of discrimination. There is no legal or scientific basis of having these laws on the book. And so, what positive things have happened since Justice Edwin called us into action? They say charity begins at home, and I will begin with a successful Kenyan case that challenged one of the many laws in Kenya that was criminalizing exposure and non-disclosure. This is Section 24 of the HIV and AIDS Prevention and Control Act, and three judges, Justice Isaac Lenaola, Justice George Odunga, and Judge Mombi Gugi, struck down that law on a suit that was brought by the AIDS Law Project in Kenya, where they said that the law was vague, the law was unconstitutional, it violated the right to privacy, because in that law it said if a person knew their HIV status, they had an obligation to inform their sexual contact of their HIV status, and that they had an obligation to make efforts to ensure that they do not put the other person at a risk of getting infected. So the law placed the entire obligation on the person who was living with HIV. And the law further on went to say that if the person did not want to disclose, the healthcare worker was then mandated to disclose on behalf of that person, whether they liked it or not. Gladly, the Kenyan High Court has struck down that law, one of the many successes. We've also had tremendous success And I would urge you to have a look at this publication by UNDP on the Global Commission on Law and HIV, which rightfully tells us that we have had success in the repeal of certain criminal laws. And we must appreciate the following countries that I'm going to name that have been able to repeal the criminal laws since 2008 when Justice Edwin Cameron last spoke to us. Ghana, Greece, Honduras, Kenya, Malawi, Mongolia, Switzerland, Tajikistan, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and at least 2 states in the US, including California and Iowa, who have been able to repeal laws that put people living with HIV at a risk. Let's congratulate those countries. So we know science has taught us a lot since HIV came in the 1980s. We now know if people take their ARVs, suppress their viral load, they are unable to put other people at a risk of getting infected. We know science has taught us that people living with HIV can live a normal life and that HIV is no longer a death threat. But more still needs to be done because the application of this law irrationally is still continuing even as we speak. Even though we know what science says, even though we know what the law says, even though we know there are decisions that say that this is not the right way to go, these laws are being applied in this day and age of time. And to demonstrate that, I will quickly run you to 3 cases in 3 different African countries for you to appreciate this perspective. Allow me to take you to my neighboring country, Uganda, and bring to you the very painful story of a 64-year-old nurse called Rosemary Nambiru, a grandmother, a mother, a member of the International AIDS Society, and a nurse who had served her life. In 2014, while drawing blood from an infant, the 67-year-old nurse had a needle stick injury, and she was falsely or wrongly accused of intentionally exposing a child to HIV while administering an injection. She was arrested on live TV, she was paraded in front of live media, and the initial charge against her was attempted murder. Take into account that the child was never infected with HIV. She was taken to a magistrate's court, the charges were changed to aggravated assault, and she was eventually imprisoned for 3 years. Her sentence was appealed thanks to colleagues in Uganda from ICW, from Uganet and Sehud, and even when their decision was appealed, she had already spent 5 months in remand serving her sentence. And even when you look at the appeal decision, the judge doesn't strike down the law, but says that the sentence was too harsh and reduces the sentence to the period she has served in the remand so that she can be released. But what I want to bring out of this story, apart from all the mishaps in the legal, is the role of the media. Rose's life has been tarnished. The headlines were, "Killer nurse arrested." And even after she was released by the court, the next headline was, "HIV murderer nurse released." So the media, you have a role to shape the lives of people. You can destroy it or you can create it, and Rosemary case provides an avenue. Luckily, there's a toolkit by HIV Justice Network that the media can turn to be able to ensure they get the messaging right. I now want to move you to Malawi, a very lovely country in the heart of Southern Africa. And I want to bring to your attention a case, EL versus the state. This case speaks to a woman who is living with HIV and on antiretroviral treatment, who was charged of unlawful, negligent, and reckless conduct likely to spread a disease dangerous to life. What was her crime? During a community meeting, she accidentally breastfed another person's child. The child did not contract HIV, and the evidence on record shows that it was accidental. On a plea of guilty because she was not represented in court by anyone, she was sentenced to 9 months in prison and hard labor. Can you imagine that? But gladly, thanks to the work of a brilliant organization in Southern Africa called SALC, SALC, who have invested in training lawyers with support from the Global Fund, were able to train lawyers from 10 African countries, and one of them included my learned colleague, Wesley Mwafurila. Wesley, who picked up this story in the media, took up the appeal before the court and took it before a judge who had also been part of a training funded by the Global Fund, administered by UNDP, to argue the case, brought forth to the court evidence about what is the risk of transmission through breastfeeding, brought in evidence from experts who knew about HIV and the law, like Michaela Clayton, to explain to the court. And based on that, the court overturned the decision and set this woman free. Would you imagine a lady who has to breastfeed a child would now be languishing in jail had it not been for legal intervention from lawyers and judges who knew about the law? So this proves to the point that funders, you must invest in structural remedies. You must invest in structural barriers to HIV. The Global Fund is doing it. Nothing stops PEPA from doing it, and nothing stops the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from funding human rights work. I began by saying charity starts at home, and I want to end with a case from Kenya. This is as recent as 4 months ago, and a case currently happening in one of our counties called Kericho. We have the case of a gentleman, E.W., whose name we cannot release for purposes of confidentiality. But he's a 30-year-old man who was arrested by police on an evening. And while he was resisting arrest and in the struggle to have him arrested, he beat the thumb of the police officer. And when that happened, he was violently assaulted. And from what we have on record, they took him to a hospital, and he was tested for HIV without his consent, and he only came to learn about his HIV status in court when the charges were being read to him, and he was charged under Section 26 of the Sexual Offences Act, where he was charged with deliberately infecting a police officer with a deadly disease. Remember, HIV is not a death sentence. Remember, science has shown us that the risk in transmitting HIV through biting is very negligible or almost impossible. Take back the first case we had in Texas in the US, where a man was sentenced to 35 years in jail for spitting at a police officer, and juxtapose it with what is happening in Kericho. And that is why we are saying work still needs to be done. So what are my recommendations going forward? I will start with the donors because they are the pass holders of this important money. Donors, you need to fund the right work. You need to fund sensitization of communities. Communities need to know their rights. Communities need to know where do you go when your rights have been violated. You need to fund sensitization programs for lawyers, for judges, for law enforcement officers, for healthcare workers, and even parliamentarians, so that they can understand what is the implication of some of these laws and what do they have to take into account when they are deciding cases, when they are representing clients, when they are arresting clients, when they are providing healthcare services, and when they are debating in their parliaments around this particular issue. So donors, please invest in the right programs. UNAIDS has a fantastic 7-guide program that you could consider and invest. And if we can invest in the 68 countries in the world that still have laws that criminalize people who are living with HIV, we will be speaking a different story. To the judges in the room, I must say, leaving this room, and if you go back to your homes and you have a case you're going to listen to, apply science, apply the law, apply rationality, and be able to ensure that you make a decision that takes the rights-based approach into interest. And if you're a lawyer in this room and you get a case, you must think it through, you must consult, and you must put forward the right evidence and case before the court, because a judge is only good as the lawyer who appears before him. So if you bring a bad case, you will get a bad judgment. If you bring a good case, you will get a good judgment. And to the law enforcement officers in the room, yes, you have to enforce the law, but you have to be able to see, am I paying rationale to the law that is in place? You know what science says, you know the effect of that. Would you want to have a mind shift in the way you enforce some of these particular laws? To the members who represent government in the ministries of health, in the National AIDS Control Council, what you have a role to ensure that our policies are pushing more for information and rights-based information to people who are living with HIV and communities around this. I've already spoken to the media. You have a role to communicate the right message and to do it in a very responsible way. And I cannot miss the opportunity to communicate to the first ladies, of whom we've learned do not need an appointment to the heads of states, that you would be able to raise these issues at the highest level and know that certain laws would hinder this coming into place. I have saved the best for last, and this is to the scientists who probably are the most in this room. There's going to be an expert consensus statement that will be made public tomorrow, and this statement has been developed by a number of experts and endorsed by many of them. This statement has been developed largely to break down what does science say about the risk of transmission. So to the doctors, to the epidemiologists, to the nurses, any healthcare worker in the room, my plea to you is that look out for this statement and help out back in your country by providing expert affidavit evidence for those who are taking forward cases, for those who are writing policies, for you to be able to take that forward. So as I conclude, I want to end with two quotes. One from my favorite publication, and the Bible I ask you to look at, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. If you want to know anything about HIV and the law, this is the Bible. If you're a funder and if you want to fund anything about HIV and the law and TB and hepatitis, this is the Bible. So I will read two quotes so that I can be able to ensure the message gets home, and I will be done. So from the Global Commission report, the law alone cannot stop AIDS, nor can the law alone be blamed when HIV responses are inadequate. But the legal environment can play a powerful role in the well-being of people living with HIV and those vulnerable to HIV. Good laws, fully resourced and rigorously enforced, can widen access to prevention and healthcare services, improve the quality of treatment, enhance social support for people affected by the epidemic, protect human rights that are vital to survival, and save the public money. And to my final quote, and in honor of the award I got yesterday, as Elizabeth Taylor said from this podium in 1992, we are here to fight the virus, not to fight the people. HIV is not a crime. Thank you for listening to me.
Good morning. I am Robert Suttle. I am not a criminal, but I've served 6 months in the Louisiana State Prison on an HIV non-disclosure charge. Now I am based in New York. I'm Assistant Director of the Sero project and coordinate a network of HIV criminalization survivors, people who have been threatened or are currently being prosecuted for HIV crime. Sero is a US-based network of people living with HIV and allies fighting for HIV-related stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. Here's a picture of my mugshot, which I've never really shared publicly with anyone, but I decided to do it for this occasion. As you see at the top, that is the statute under which I was prosecuted under, intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. A former partner filed charges against me after we broke up. As a result of that experience, I accepted a felony plea bargain, served 6 months in prison, and had to register as a sex offender for 15 years. So I thought I was not the lucky one, but however, it turns out that I am. Compared that there are many who have received much harsher sentences. And as pictured here, Michael Johnson, who is in the state of Missouri, is currently incarcerated, initially received 30-year sentences. However, his case was overturned under appeal, and he's now has agreed to a plea bargain of 10 years. And we also have Kerry Thomas, who is currently incarcerated in the Idaho Correctional Center, who's also a Sero board member, currently facing 30 years. Kerry is HIV positive, but the virus is undetectable. He used a condom and didn't transmit HIV to anyone. He will not be out of prison until 2038. And it is currently 2018. So he's already 8 years, at least 8 years into that 30-year sentence. So it doesn't end upon release. There are social consequences that occur, and there's also sex offender registration. And then there's also the day-to-day life difficulty around employment, housing, traveling, even voting in some places, and even receiving government benefits. There is the social stigma and the loss of privacy, outing HIV status and sexual orientation to family and friends. When this experience happened to me, I was not out about my sexuality, nor did I share with my family about my HIV status. At a young age, I was always taught personal responsibility, and so when this happened to me, I knew that I had to do what I had to do, and that was to take care of myself. And I knew how to do that. I knew how to go to appointments. I knew how to take medication. And so I felt like I didn't need to share that information with my family. However, when the prosecution happened, everything came out. I didn't really have to say one word. Thankfully, it was not all in the media, but there was a publication that showed that my photo, as well as the fact that I had been prosecuted. To me, that was enough. Other people, by chance, experienced other social media embarrassment. And many of you may have seen flyers or pictures of people's faces who've been prosecuted flashing across your Facebook timeline or even in your news media. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because it only further stigmatizes the individual and also sends the wrong messages to the public about what this person is actually being accused of. And also it exposes their HIV status. Other consequences that I've even experienced is makes dating difficult. A lot of times I found that it was going to be challenging to share about myself with someone, not only telling them that I was HIV positive, but also going further to say that I was also prosecuted, and thinking about, oh my God, what would they think about that? You know, what would they think about me? And so, in essence, it does make it difficult to really meet people and to be open. Notice I didn't say honest, but at least open about something that's very personal and private about your life, because you never know how people are going to receive you. There's the constant threat of prosecution, where it's used as a tool for abuse or control. The worst thing that you can do for a person living with HIV or any other person that has history of trauma and violence in their life is to call the police on them. I've had that happen to me before, and it does not feel good, and it definitely sends the wrong message, because if a police officer or a law enforcement officer was to show up, who do you think that they will believe? Particularly someone that has a record, or a felony record already, and yet you're not the person that initiated the violence or the aggression. But simply because of what you have or how you're labeled, whether it be a convicted felon or someone who is formerly incarcerated, those things can have a negative stigma to them, and a person's life can continue to further be damaged. And then there's also the mental health challenges. Although I'm standing here before you telling you about something so private and so personal about myself, that's not always easy for a lot of people who've experienced prosecution. A lot of times they don't want to be exposed sharing this information because of the trauma of what they've already gone through. However, I didn't recognize it as much as trauma for myself, but I have come to accept that it is trauma. Because as I continue to live out each day of my life, I have to wonder, am I going to be able to have housing? Am I going to be able to keep a job? Or am I going to continue to, or is the police going to come knocking on my door from someone accusing me of God knows what? So I wanted to say that also with the survivors that I know, a lot of them have attempted suicide or considered it, or come to terms with some addiction issues. And so it's not really easy because, as we all should know, that any person that uses drugs or perhaps having sex or whatever their coping mechanism is, it's their way of coping with a lot of times with life and a lot of times what we as people in society throw at them. And it doesn't always feel good. It makes you depressed. It makes you not want to get up every day and face the world, because of not only what you deal with personally with being a person living with HIV, but also the additional traumas that come by example of criminalization or even isolation or any other type of traumas. So sex offender registry, community notifications, ad in paper and postcards to neighbors. When I was prosecuted, I had to pay fees, not necessarily $600 at that time, it was $60, but they've since raised the fees up to $600 as the way to keep people who are registered sex offenders out of the community. And I have to tell you, when you have postcards coming out in your community within a certain mile radius of where you lived, to church members, to people in your schools, to people you work with, to people who work in the stores in your community, that's not a good feeling. And also when you have to put ads in the newspaper that further expands what you've experienced to hundreds and even thousands of people, that is not a good feeling. Other restrictions is freedoms on to move around in parks and schools. If you're a registered sex offender, there are certain areas that you're not allowed to be in. There's many restrictions that are very, make it very difficult for people who are registered sex offenders to move around. And one thing that I'm reminded is of a person who's a mother. She's one of our survivors, she's a mother, and she's also a registered sex offender. And there are times where she cannot even take her own child to the park or even have her child live with her if she's not able to find adequate housing because of her designation as a registered sex offender. And that is crazy when a mother can't even be with her child simply because of restriction that's been placed on her based on her past. There are registries that are available online, open to the public and employers and landlords, which makes it even more challenging to when they do background checks on you, whether you're applying for a job or getting housing. I've experienced all of this. And before I knew it, I was trying to apply for an apartment. They told me that I could not get it because I was a registered sex offender. And until I was able to clear that up, then I could come back and try to reapply. And in Louisiana, where I'm from, in certain states in the United States, it is noted on your driver's license, sex offender. And I have a picture here. So can you imagine, whether it be your passport or whether it be your driver's license or any ID, going to the bank, going to the hospital, or any place where you have to show ID, and to having those words sex offender right under your photo. So just take a moment and think about how would you feel if you had to deal with that every day of your life. So as I alluded to earlier, the day-to-day life can be difficult. Employment is, for me, I really have been a saving grace by getting involved with Sero and doing this advocacy work. However, I feel that if I was to step outside of that, outside of this sort of bubble that I've been in, that I've been appreciative of and grateful to meet so many people and also to educate and inform people about the importance of HIV criminalization and what we must do about that. But many people have found difficulty finding employment. And that continues to be an issue. And there have been some great strides to sort of ban the box so that you're not having to answer that question. But a lot of people have not really taken upon themselves to understand the burden that people who are formerly incarcerated carry as a result of getting employment. Housing. I've experienced this where I was involved with, in a relationship or getting to know someone, and this person had to move from their home after being there for nearly 10 years in order for me to come and live with them, or for us to find a place that would accept us living together. And I felt so bad because this person lived in their home for 10 years and would move as a sort of sacrifice to me because of my experience. And I just think no one should have to do that. No one should have to give up anything that they treasure simply because of restrictions and labels that we put on people. And again, benefits, inability for certain government programs, benefits, and also when you carry convictions in the United States, there's in some jurisdictions you're not able to vote. In other words, you don't have a voice in regards to the people that are supposed to be representing you in the government bodies. But I've since, when I was back in my home state, I did make it a point to get my voting rights back. But not a lot of people have the ability to do that. Thank you. So, HIV criminalization is bad public health policy because it drives stigma, discourages testing and treatment access, and is making this epidemic worse. HIV criminalization inflicts a horrific injustice on people living with HIV, while all of us now are just one disgruntled ex-partner away from a courtroom. HIV criminalization is cruel to the families and friends of those convicted as they become collateral damage, their lives often severely impacted or destroyed by the prosecution of a loved one. And I would just say, I remember when I had to surrender myself to go to prison, and I don't know how many of you can imagine having to wait 45 days to surrender yourself to go to prison. And I am someone that was very close to my grandparents, my grandmother at the time. She since has passed on. But I knew I had to do 6 months. And so my intentions were to go in and get out because I had to come back and take care of my grandmother. And I'm grateful to God that I was able to stay focused and allow myself to get through those 6 months to come back home to her and to at least be with her for a few more years before she passed. So understand that this not only affects the individual that's going through, but it also affects their family. And so I wanted to leave you with this. If you're not familiar with HIV is not a crime or HIV criminalization in any instance, please visit the SeroProject.com website, and there's plenty of information there. And please join our movement and follow us. We're doing great things there in the state, and we're also connected to the wider HIV Justice Worldwide Network. And I encourage you to support reform in all countries and all states around this issue. And one last note. The U.S. is unsafe, even for many who already live there, and especially for those most impacted. Thank you. I'm glad you all agree. So the IAS must move the conference. And so there's information here where you can please pledge your support. No AIDS 2020 in a Trump's USA. Hashtag AIDS 2020 for all. And please visit the website, AIDS2020forall.org, for lots of resources. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to share, and I hope that you've been inspired by all that's been shared today on this panel. Thank you so much.